Dr. Divas Basneth. Dr. Basneth is the lead of Water and Climate Program at NDRI. Dr. Basneth, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Asmaji. May I have your attention, please? May I request you to sit in your respective places? We are about to start the panel discussion. We have 4 panelists and special remarks by Professor Ram Manohar Shrestha, as we have indicated in our program. 2 of our panelists are joining virtually, Dr. Zhang Lanying from China and Professor Jyoti Parikh from India. Professor Dr. Lanying, are you online? If so, can you unmute her and so she can say hello?
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
Dr.
I'm online.
Lanying, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you loud and clear. Thank you so much. If you don't mind, you can switch on your video also so that we can see your face. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I'm switched on,
Yeah,
but
okay.
I don't know why
Can you
appear.
have Dr. Lanying and Professor Parikh video on? Similarly, Professor Parikh, can you maybe can you speak a few words just to make sure we hear your sound? Professor Parikh.
Okay. I will re-enter to this Zoom meeting to see whether I can open the video, right?
Yeah. We can hear you, Professor Parikh, so we will proceed now.
Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? You hear me?
Yes, we do. We do hear you, and we see you very nice. Thank you so much, Professor Parikh. So without much ado, I would like to request the 2 panelists physically present here, Dr. Arun Bhakta Shrestha and Dr. Madhav Karki, to kindly come to the dais, please. Yeah. And similarly, we will have Professor Ram Manohar Shrestha making his special remarks at the end of the panel discussion. Sir, can you also come to the dais, please? Yeah, maybe Arunji and yeah, Dr. Arun from EC Mode. Yeah. The panel session will be for 85 minutes so that we can stop before 5 minutes before lunchtime. So we can have our lunch, start our lunch at 1:30. So I hope we'll be able to maintain the time. Okay, I think before I start, we will have the first round of questions for around, I'll give each participants 8 minutes to speak, and I will be asking some guiding questions for them to speak. Just to kickstart the panel discussion, I think we had a very interactive and very exemplary keynote speech from Dr. Pema, the Director General of EC Mode. So I think he has provided the masala, I would call it, for our panel discussion. So he has provided all the ingredients to do our panel discussion, and I will try to focus the questions related to his key messages and some other issues. Just before that, our title of our panel discussion is Way Forward for a Climate Resilient Future. I'm a water professional. I work in hydrology, water resources. But what does a water engineer or water resources person think about climate resilience? Why climate resilience? From my limited experience, I would say we are used to climate variability. It's not that we don't know climate variability, but we were used to unknown. We were used to climate uncertainty, but we knew based on the last 30 years of data or more years of data, the future would be in this, within this uncertainty. We knew what would be the extreme events, we knew what would be the low flows, we knew what would be the high flows. But unfortunately, with climate and other man-induced changes, we don't know the future now. So we are moving from what I call from a known unknown to an unknown future. So we will have to now, we used to manage risk. I mean, I think all professionals, we manage our risk, knowing that the future would be within certain limits. We use statistical probabilistic models to define our 1,000-year, a flood that would happen in 1,000 years, a minimum flow that would happen in certain number of years. We knew that, but now we don't know. So I think we are moving from a risk domain to a resilience domain because we are moving to an unknown future. And today, I think we are very lucky to have very eminent 4 panelists who are globally recognized experts and personalities to discuss this important agenda for a resilient future for all of us. And to top it, to add cream to the cake, to add value to the discussion, we are lucky to have Professor Ram Manohar Shrestha, Professor Emeritus of AIT, a renowned energy, economics, and climate change expert, to provide his special remarks towards the end of this session. So I will now directly go to the questions to Dr. Zhang Lianying. She's the founder of Sources for Action, co-founder of Xihai Foundation China. I think we have her, can you display the short bio note we have for Dr. Lianying? We have our bio note displayed here, so I will not read it again because I think I will give you some exercise to read that yourself. But I would now like to ask 2 guiding questions to Dr. Lianying, and I would request her to provide her answer in 7 or 8 minutes. The first question is, as we are all amazed with the unprecedented economic growth of China in the last few decades. Now, how do you think, Dr. Lianying, China can sustain this in the context of China's commitments to mitigate global warming, greenhouse gases, as well as to manage emerging adverse impacts of climate change? So how would China planning to sustain that economic growth? And the second follow-up questions I will ask now also is, what climate actions are China focusing on? How can other developing countries learn from China to follow a more green, inclusive, and resilient economic development pathway? Dr. Lianying, are my questions clear? May I ask you to respond in 7 to 8 minutes, please?
Thank you for asking these questions, which is really kind of critical from Chinese perspective as well. I think this morning we talked a lot. Actually, I was in the past few days, even in Beijing, we feel the sudden rise and fall of temperature, more than 10 degrees, the differences. It is really rarely happened, and I never experienced in my life. So I think all of us also experienced the extremely high temperature last year. So those are leading to led us to feel the global warming to global boiling. So climate change becomes a global challenge beyond the national boundary. And so looking at China, we talk about China, we indeed had experienced a period of high economic growth. So this growth is not only reflected in the rapid expansion of the total economic aggregate, but also in the optimization of the economic structure and the improvement of the quality. But we also have paid a heavy price. As we look, even for the climate change, we understood the causes behind the climate change and the impact on the social, economic, and ecological dimensions are the process of industrialization, urbanization that has long occurred, the mainstream occupy the mainstream position in development. And also behind the industrialization and urbanization is the mankind take the anti-ecological positions to pursue the radical developmentalism with the spread of consumerism in our society. So what we are facing is that in this process, the more high growth is pursued, the greater the cost. So we pay a heavy price. So China, as we see, has become the world's largest country in terms of environmental degradation and pollution during the same period of industrialization process in China. We are also facing serious consequences of this environmental degradation and pollution problems. So what we take the shift since the beginning of 21st century is we do have a lot of national policy development. So for example, in the year 2020, we already launched a national strategy talking about integrated rural-urban development, because the urbanization divide the urban and rural, and more development in the cities, but neglect the rural development. And the concept on harmonious society in 2004, and multifunctional agricultural development policy in 2006, and the construction of eco-civilization on 2007. Inclusive growth strategy in 2009, and the eco-civilization strategy launched in 2012, and further rural revitalization strategy in 2017. And we also set up a carbon emission peak and carbon neutrality goals on 2020. So all this indicate that we are shifting from the pre-capital development to a more eco-civilization focused national strategy. So that implies we cannot have the same high economic growth solely. So economic eco-civilization looking the major transition or the adjustment of this series of national strategy reflect a kind of a new adjustment. It's a new shift from pre-capital to pre-people. So the economic development will be more for the common prosperity shared by all the people. And the prosperity is not only material, but also spiritual. So this is a better, it's kind of coordination between material civilization and the spiritual civilization in order to realize harmonious coexistence between human and nature and peaceful development. So this is overall shift from the pre-capital, the economic driven extraction of natural resources development to ecological civilization construction. So in that sense, we see it's no longer the driving for the high speed or of GDP growth. Is rather than kind of holistic development. So, which is in China we talk about eco-civilization construction. So it's like the globally what we talk about sustainable development. In that sense, so the eco-civilization is actually looking for the highest level of civilization, which beyond the goes beyond the traditional industrialization. So it's not talking about per se, but emphasize diversity as its connotation for human self-awareness, self-awakening to pursue the harmony with the nature. So eco-civilization actually means man and nature coexist in harmony, material and spiritual civilization in harmony, and to realize the common prosperity and shared and enjoyed spiritual and material and peace development. So the key to realize this, China takes a lot of different, so especially in the economic sector, the great challenge and also the action towards addressing is how to balance between the economic development and environmental protection and biodiversity conservation.
Dr. Lanning?
So China's approach is built the ecological economic system characterized by industrial ecology and ecological industrialization. So this promotes high quality economic development in the process of improving the environment. So how to interpret this, like industrial ecology, for example, agriculture. In the past, a lot of industrialized agricultural production, monocropping and overuse of chemicals. And now we're talking about how to turn this agricultural into ecologically sound and natural resources saving, like saving water, protect the soil, but also friendly to the environment. So in China, we're talking about the agriculture, promoting the multifunctional agriculture. It's not only for the products, production, processing and services, but also can looking at its functions of education for health, for the cultural heritage, and carried on. So this is integrated way of looking agroecology development. So that's one of the approach in that. So this morning we'll also talk about the outflow of youth from rural areas to the cities, and also aging of farming communities, and the stagnant of the rural economy. So the national strategy of rural revitalization launched in year 2017 in China aims to addressing this trends, aging farming, outflow of labor's outflow of capitals and resources, and especially the rural youth go migrate to the cities. So this strategy has a pathway for rural reconstruction, for the youth to have the space to do rural revitalization through agricultural farming or cultural
Lanning,
revitalization to achieve common prosperity with realization of material civilization and spiritual civilization, and harmonic coexist between man and nature.
Thank
but
you,
of
Dr.
course,
Lanning.
this needs industrial innovation, which integrated Syrian practice.
Yeah.
So in the past decades, there's a lot
Dr.
of
Lanning,
efforts at national and local level. So we're talking about Chinese culture of
Dr.
harmony
Lanning,
culture,
may I
talking about harmony coexist with the
thank you.
nature. But we're
Thank you,
also
Dr.
talking
Lanning.
about cultivation.
May I ask you
culture.
to just
Is the
wrap in a minute?
self-cultivation of our
I'll give you
body and mind.
more time in the next round, please.
Strengthen our cultivate our inner strengths to translate into action. We're talking about behavior change, taking actions
Dr.
to
Lanning,
address the issues.
Thank you.
Only at individual level is not enough, but also at the family
Lanning,
level.
can you hear me,
we
please?
talk about taking care of the parents. Parents are kind for the children. Husband and wife with harmony relations for a happy life, and the children, brothers and sisters, and pay respect, pay help, mutual help. So it's really cultivating a family
Dr. Lanning,
environment with love and harmony.
Dr. Lanning,
When the family is in harmony and happiness, so we can extend it to our community level, taking actions to love your family members, extend it to love your neighbors, love your colleagues, and this with the community level, we're extended with all this kindness and love with humanity, and further to address the issues collectively. So this is cultivation culture. Yeah.
Dr. Lanning,
Yes.
I give you some time in the next round.
Send you
Thank
the
you
revised
very
slides,
much
huh?
for now.
I have sent you the revised slides.
I think-
Okay. How many minutes?
No, actually, we'll give you in the
Ma'am,
next
I have
round.
sent you the
for,
revised
to-
slides.
We'll give you in the next round.
I
to
have
let
sent you the
respond
revised
further.
slides. Acha, yeah, okay.
So I think I'll move to now. Thank you so much. I think you made a very clear
So
case
now-
about
So
harmony.
in China, we talk about this cultivation culture from social mobilization, bottom-up process, but also national strategies create space. For example, rural revitalization strategy create a
Dr.
space
Lanning,
for
I have
youth
to
participate.
I have
For
to mute
example,
you. Sorry
community
for that.
support agriculture,
Okay,
they
I think
can
she cannot
apply
hear me.
their
Can you mute
knowledge
her?
of
Mute her?
digital technology.
I think I have to take that action. Sorry about that. Dr. Lanning, I'll let you speak a little later. Now I will save time. I'm sorry about the short time given to you. I will now move to Dr. Arun Bhakta Shrestha. He's the strategic lead of environment and climate risk. Sorry, maybe I didn't get the right thing. I think in the morning, Dr. Pema highlighted the vulnerability and risk of the changing climate, loss of glaciers, snow cover, and other water-induced hazards in terms of water availability as well as climate-induced hazards impacted by climate change. Maybe I would request Arunji to add some evidence on what are the key drivers of risk across different sectors, particularly to water, food, energy, and ecosystem. And there is another question, depending on, this is a guiding question, I'll let you, and what actions are necessary to manage these risks and to ensure a resilient future. Okay, Dr. Arun, around 7 minutes for you too, if you don't mind.
Shall I go both questions in one go? Okay. Thank you very much. As you have said, the keynote in the morning actually gave a lot of evidences about what's happening and what could be done. So I don't think there is too much to add. Just I would like to, focus on what you have asked in these two questions. The drivers of change to those sectors and what could be done. Now, what I would like to change a little bit is not go into each of those sectors that you have mentioned, water, energy, food, and others, but more take it from nexus angle. Because that's what I believe should be the approach moving forward, especially in the context of climate change and other socioeconomic changes, because there are many ways to look at it, but we normally take it from the water, energy, food, ecosystem nexus angle, which actually, looks at all those sectors from the interconnection between them. So it provides opportunity to have a more holistic understanding of the complex challenges actually happen around those sectors and between them, and also work on more effective and equitable solutions. So with that, I would then talk about the drivers. Of course, the climate is definitely the most overarching and most important driver today. But from a nexus angle, I think what it does is through the variabilities, through the trends and through the extremes, which we are experiencing more and more today, it actually hits more on each of the sector, but from a nexus angle, I think it hits quite critically on the water availability. when I say water availability, it is not just the water scarcity angle, but also the surplus angle, which we often call too much and too little water. And with that change, actually, it actually has interconnectedness with all the other sectors, like energy, food, and ecosystem. So, you know, which in a combination exacerbates vulnerability and risks. So it is not just water sector being impacted, not just, you know, food sector or agriculture sector, but the interconnectedness which actually amplifies the impact. So I think that is one very important overarching driver I would like to mention here. But then moving beyond that, I think there are a lot of other drivers which can be, you know, in a simple manner clubbed under, you know, more under the socio-economic, you know, title, right? So one of the most important thing about the socio-economic change, the demographic change, the population change actually is again also happening in the water sector, but different from the climate variability and change. So climate and variability is causing certain stress on water, but then the socio-economic change also has another kind of, you know, change in the water availability in most cases, creating more demand and more scarcity. So this is what I would like to highlight. It is about population growth, urbanization, industrialization, which is coupled often with very unsustainable management of water, which leads to more, you know, scarcity and, you know, problems, right, in those sectors. Other things, not going into detail, I would like to highlight are unsustainable land use change and land degradation, pollution, and inadequate infrastructure and resource management. So these are some of the drivers I would like to say, you know, which actually has a much amplified impact if we look at it from the nexus angle, the interconnectedness of those sectors. So having that approach, the nexus approach is also allows us to address those challenges more effectively, looking at the synergies of any intervention we can have and also trade-offs, right? So that's what I would like to mention here. Moving into the second questions, what we can do, Divasji. What I would like to say is, you know, now focusing more on what Jepse asked in the question to manage cryosphere water risks, too much, too little water. Oftentimes we come up with a menu of actions, right? You know, 10 action points, 20 action points, I don't know how many action points. I would like to differ and make it, you know, more contextual. I think we have to be really contextual. A prescribed menu probably doesn't work. So I was very happy that, you know, in the opening session, there were a lot of discussion about adaptation. And that is definitely in the context of change we are experiencing, it is very important. In the context of today's discussion, water management practices, you know, improved water management practices, nature-based solutions for managing too much and too little water, promoting climate resilient practices, for example, in agriculture are very much important that we must do. But what I would like to very much add is, and Dr. Pahari very nicely summed it up, that it has to be evidence-based. And I'm very happy NDRI also very much emphasizes on evidence. These all needs to be evidence-based because we are moving into a very dynamic world. We often call it uncharted territory. You know, future is not going to be anything like a past. It's not going to be a gradual shift, right? So we really need to know as good as possible what the future is likely to be, and our interventions, our adaptations should actually be based on that. Now, for countries like Nepal, I think too much water is a big problem. So having early warning system backed by monitoring, very sound monitoring system is very important. Sustainable water management practices, promoting well-known things like watershed management, spring shed management, groundwater recharge, nature-based solutions, etc., are very important. Ecosystem restorations, there are many more. I'm going to close down. But then there are two things I would like to very much highlight, and it came also in the morning, that we are living in a shared territory, in shared river basins and shared landscapes. So all those, interventions, all those strategies would not work if we do not collaborate across boundaries. We have seen a lot of floods, Glof, for example, originating from Tibet and highly, impacting Nepal, 2016. So unless we have a shared, effort in managing those challenges, it would not be effective. And then for all that, we really need to have a strong capacity building element and then knowledge sharing element. I think these are very much necessary. So I think these are some of the things which we could adopt for more resilient future. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Devashi. If there are opportunities in the future, I'll add more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arun. I think the Nexus approach was very relevant. I will now move to Professor Jyoti Parikh, who's the Executive Director of Integrated Research and Action for Development. And she's a very well-known personality with a very global experience. I think I would request you to look at the bio note there. For Professor Parikh also, India is a rapidly growing economy with massive development needs. I would like to ask you, what are the climate mitigation and decarbonization strategies that India has adopted? And I also would like to, if you could add, what can other South Asian countries learn from India's experience? Over to you, Professor Parikh. I request you to limit it to 8 minutes or something, if you don't mind. Thank you. Yeah, you have a presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And this is a wonderful experience to get together with our South Asian neighbors. And really, I feel we should have a common strategy. I've been working in this area for a long time, and we work also in climate mitigation as well as climate adaptation and resilience. In climate resilience, we have done much work in cities, and actually, Indian government brought out the national mission of habitat, a sustainable habitat in 2008. And we have been helping them to develop strategies for disaster management, for early warning systems, and so on. I would also like to say that India being the third largest country, and now it is at a very strong development at a point where its development is picking up very rapidly, and as a result, a lot of excitement is there in energy options, and every day you hear about hydrogen, solar, wind, and nuclear, how to make non-fossil as the, so India is decarbonizing while it's growing. That's a very different experience from others who have first developed and then started mitigation. So that's one example that India could share with others also. Can I have the next slide? Yeah. But this is just about our institute. We work in sustainable urban development, climate change, energy and power systems, agriculture, and Asia Center for Sustainable Development, Poverty Alleviation and Gender. And what? able to. Okay, maybe you handle the slides. The next one, please. I'll quickly, because I know we have limited time. So in India, it had made very ambitious Paris commitments. That time, it set up two organizations, International Solar Alliance and Coalition for Disaster Resilience Initiative. And we have about 50 to 60 countries have joined these initiatives after Paris. And in terms of our mitigation commitments, our NDCs, Nationally Determined Contribution at Glasgow, we had promised, and it's a sort of quantitative target that we gave in the international forum, which is something most people, many countries resist, but India said it will try to do 500 gigawatt non-fossil generation capacity, and that would be roughly 60 to 70% of total power capacity from non-fossil. We have already reached 43% in 2024. So I hope we succeed doing that. India's net generation would be reduced by 1 GT by developing sinks. Emission intensities would be lower. Intensity is a figure for CO2 per GDP. So everybody wants to increase GDP, but CO2 per GDP should decline. Otherwise, your emissions will grow at the same proportion as the GDP, and that's not acceptable. We have also made a promise of net zero 2070, but perhaps we might do it earlier, but time can tell. And of course, technology and finance will have to be mobilized for this. Next. So India has taken many low carbon inclusive growth strategies. One is the renewable is being pushed in a long-term feed-in tariffs, and also transmission charges are waived and so on. And we have already decided not to do any all coal power plants must be supercritical power plants. Fuel efficiency should increase, but EV should reach 35% by 2030, and 20% ethanol blending, and many, so that both the society is changing by adopting to two-wheelers, four-wheelers and three-wheelers into electric vehicles, as well as the infrastructure, which is managed by the power system people, industry, and so on. Everything is kind of, right now, India is in a very dynamic mode. There is a modal shift and alternate fuels also. Digital progress is actually can help considerably, and India has a very high access to the level for digital accessibility. And freight shift to railways is now electrified completely, and demand side management, LED bulbs, buildings, industry, agriculture, everything is changing rapidly. Next. So India, but there is a global level, there is a lot of inequity, and I'm sure that much of the South Asian countries face that also, that those who have not emitted much also suffer the most, and those who need to grow do not have carbon space to grow. Now, if we try to grow the other, there is always a carbon constraint. So global negotiations also should recognize that what matters is the total emissions which are out there, which you emitted even in the past. But okay, past is difficult to work out, but let's say we consider till 1990 only, when the United Nations gathered all the countries to sign the UNFCCC declaration. So difference in socio-economic and GDP levels also mandate different growth paths. So everybody, according to their resource base and according to their development level, will change their growth path and decarbonize. So all the decarbonization for Nepal, Bhutan, you already have a considerable hydro. So perhaps things are not as serious perhaps, but still everybody needs fossil fuels at the moment. Next. So next, I think I will have to. Sea level rise is another issue for India. Himalayan ecosystem also has to reckon with a lot of disaster resilience issues. Next, I think I should skip fast, please. Next, please. I think global action should, together, we should think of how to minimize cumulative emissions and all countries reach net zero, and how to postpone your emissions, because the longer it stays, the more damages it creates, encourage negative emissions, and so on. Next. And it should be acceptable to all countries. Now, India takes it seriously because, it's the third largest country or fourth if you consider EU in terms of CO2 emissions per year. But we have, as I said, we just started growing by around 2010 or so. So it is now next one. Next one. Next, please. Okay, so per capita it's still very low. So, but now population is almost, it's now stabilizing gradually. So per capita may grow a little later, but right now there is not that much difference in terms of, and it is 1/3 of the global average. So it would grow till it reaches the global average, but it's trying not to add to the, so CO2 emissions is emitted all throughout the 90s by other countries, but also developing countries would have to now recognize that there are new ways, pathways have to be found. Next. So, IEA has shown what is the sustainability scenarios for India, and and for most countries it has done, and they predict that so much emissions would be emitted by all countries and different countries. So Indian contribution is up to 200, whereas the other countries, EU has up to 500 and so on. So these are the cumulated emissions, and we think that, and that's the one which actually in the atmosphere and causing global warming. So it's
Professor
not
Parikh,
annual emissions, whether they are going up and down, but whether cumulated emissions are going up and down or not. Next.
Professor Parikh, can you finish in one and a half
So
minutes?
now I'll come to the next. I'll come to the resilience part. India has next. Yeah, also next.
Yeah, can you move?
Yeah, so we have, these are the lighting scenarios where where yellow is the LED bulbs, and it is now crossing all other modes of lighting, and that was nearly managed to reach
Professor Parikh,
now about
can you
1 billion bulbs by now, LED bulbs, and that would grow. Next.
Yeah, Professor Parikh, can you wind up, please? I'll
Yeah.
give you more
So,
time.
forget it. But that's it. Yeah, let me say that just as Ms. Lanyang pointed out, India is also talking about lifestyle related emissions should be reduced. And every time you should not just say it would be done by technology, this technology, that technology, but also we are all responsible for whatever emissions we cause. And Gandhian lifestyle is something actually India is promoted a great deal at G20 forum recently. So they said this should be discussed at the international level, what she was mentioning also, holistic development and
apologies, Dr. Parikh, Professor Parikh.
eco-sensitive development.
I'll give you more time later. Is that fine?
Together with the South Asia, we have all
Professor
culture
Parikh,
always emphasizing this.
Professor Parikh, can you hear me, please?
And recently the new generation is more into Gandhian than Vedic also culture at the same thrust. So we should think of new ways of lifestyle and life then so that more less energy is required and less damage is done to the ecosystem, urban ecosystem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Parikh. I'm sorry to ask you to end a little early. I'll now move to, thank you so much, it was very enlightening. I will now move to Dr. Madhav Karki. His credentials are very enormous, but I will just mention that he's now the member of the National Council, Climate Change Council of the Government of Nepal. So I actually, in the morning also, I think, and many speakers also highlighted that we are at the receiving end of adverse climate impacts. So as Dr. Karki's long experience working for the government and other international agencies, what is the, I mean, if you could shed light on the plan of the government to rightfully claim and benefit from global climate financing, and what's Nepal's strategy to, for example, benefit from the loss and damage framework? And I also like, if he has time, to also give his insights on how think tanks like NDRI can help in the government's endeavor for a more climate resilient future. Over to you, Dr. Karki. Thank you so much.
Thank you. At the outset, I would like to thank NDRI for giving me this opportunity. I would like to divide this question into three parts. First of all, I think there is no doubt. I think there is unanimity all over that climate change has posed multidimensional challenges to a country like Nepal. So the other question I think can be discussed in three parts. So first of all, what the government of Nepal is doing to address these challenges. And then the second part is the what strategies Nepal can take in future. And of course, the third is regarding loss and damages, what should be our strategies, as this is just evolving further. So first of all, what government of Nepal is doing, and I'm very fortunate that what Nepal government is doing, I have been part of it since the I would say the announcement of the first preparation of the first climate change policy in 2010, and then in 2000, I would consider COP26 in 2021 was actually a milestone. Milestone because Paris Agreement, although is the, I would say, the major agreement to address the climate change challenges, but it was not operational until COP26 because the Article 6 was not ratified. So during COP26, the Articles 6 of the Paris Agreement was ratified, and government of Nepal was very active in COP26. I, as the advisor of the former Prime Minister of Nepal, had contributed, and in fact, this climate change and Environment Council was inactive, and I personally took initiative to make it active so that it started running. So the first important thing is it prepared and got approval from the government, the NDC, the second NDC, then NAP was already approved, and then long-term strategy for emission reduction, it's called LTES, and then the long-term finance strategy and action plan. So these were very strong, very important documents to really define Nepal's climate change agenda. Right now, the NDC implementation plan has also been approved. So the government of Nepal has been, I think, doing right thing, that it has all the policy and then the strategy documents in place to approach international community, especially the international finance community to access its fund. Now, to give you an impression, to give you an idea how much finance we need and what is the current supply. So the demand-supply gap is really huge. The current need, as per the NDC document and NAP document, is that without any, with existing measures or under the BAU scenario, business as usual, we need $4.5 billion per year. And then with additional measures, which is the conditional, if the additional measures means that these are, if the international community provides the finance, then Nepal is going to take additional measures, and that will require $6.5 billion. So we are talking about until 2050, something like 3 to 5 times the annual GDP of Nepal. As all of you know, Nepal's GDP is about $36 billion. So we have a huge demand and supply gap, and how much is being supplied? Nepal last year got $325.25 million. So this is what Nepal is accessing now. So the government of Nepal is, I think, quite now cognizant of this reality, and it has been actively promoting certain measures how we can really scale up climate finance mobilization. And the main target for climate finance mobilization is the Green Climate Fund, which was created in 2010 and became operational in 2014, which is actually the financial arm of the Paris Agreement. And the Nepal's access so far is poor. You compare it, Bangladesh has achieved access more than $600 million, and Nepal has access so far only $87 million. So although we are most vulnerable and we deserve finance, so this, I think, is the major gap that we have to have. And by climate finance, I think I would like to say there are 4 avenues. One is international public finance, which is from multilateral financial institutions like GCF, and also Adaptation Fund, LDCF, and then we also have now the Loss and Damage Fund. Then, of course, we have the private sector, and similarly in domestic also we have public-private sector. So what Nepal should do now, because of the limited time, I would like to be brief. Nepal can take 5 strategies. The first of all is it has to do knowledge-based advocacy and very strategic diplomacy. Because our diplomacy, climate diplomacy, is at a nascent stage. It hasn't, in fact, begun. That our diplomats have started doing the climate diplomacy, and we badly need it. So, first of all, we need advocacy and diplomacy. We need an advocacy diplomacy because we have to put our case in front of the international community in a very strong way, based on science, based on evidence, and this advocacy has to be done in a whole society, whole government basis. Just government alone cannot do it. Everyone has to take responsibility. And this is the message I would like to say. The diplomacy means our foreign diplomatic missions, although they are taking labor diplomacy, now is the high time they have to take climate diplomacy. And then the second is capacity building, and capacity building of institutions. We need institutional capacity building, and we need systemic capacity building. Because UN, when it presented the SDG report this year, it said world is living in poly-crisis. So while we talk climate crisis, we should be aware that we have a pollution crisis. Actually, Kathmandu city has been most polluted city in the world for the last 2 to 3 days. And we have to also be aware of biodiversity crisis, as we are losing biodiversity in an unprecedented rate. And we also have land degradation crisis, because 40% of Nepal's agriculture and forestry land are degrading. So all these crises, if you put together, the whole is more than the sum. Means the crises are interconnected and the impacts are interconnected. That's why the second is we have to build capacity for resilience building. We have to build capacity of institutions, we have to build capacity of individuals, we have to build technical capacity, and we have to build capacity of knowing the system. because all our response have to be system-based. And then the third is Nepal. Why Nepal is not accessing enough fund from Green Climate Fund? We don't know how to develop project, which the Green Climate Fund requires, and how to write proposal, because Green Climate Fund requires paradigm shift. They need transformative change. Paradigm shift is replicability, sustainability, and scalability. And these things have to be there, and adaptation and mitigation both have to be, both objectives have to be made. So I will not go further, but project development and proposal development is the another, I think, gap we have. And then third, of course, we have to do mainstreaming and integration. We need both mainstreaming and integration. Mainstreaming of climate change means we have to mainstream climate change in every action, in all sectors. As I said, whole society, whole government approach means we have to mainstream climate change risk, we have to mainstream climate change the response, and we have to integrate. Our approach should be integrated so that you are not only addressing climate change, but you are also addressing biodiversity loss through nature-based solution type of. And then, of course, the last one is we need climate finance. Without climate finance, we cannot, because Nepal alone, Nepal's budget doesn't allow to have even a minimum response, which we need to do, as Dr. Arun was pointing out what we need. So I will say that these 4 or 5 strategies are badly needed. We need, of course, research. We need research-based knowledge. And then I will go to the last part of the question, which is on the loss and damage. As all of you know, loss and damage is evolving fund. In COP28, they have agreed to create the fund, but the fund is not operational. There is hardly any money, $700 million is there, whereas our need is in billions of dollars. But what Nepal has to do is, they have to do again 3, 4 things. First of all, Nepal has to create evidence, and they have to prepare and present this evidence in a manner which UNFCCC requires. UNFCCC requires evidence in a research-based, rigorously analyzed, and robustly presented way. The triple R's are very, very important. And our evidence still lacks this robustness, research-based, and rigorous presentation. So first of all, is prepare evidence, and then make presentation. The second, of course, you have to, after that, then when you do this research-based, what we call evidence, then you have to negotiate. In the COPs, we have to negotiate why Nepal deserves loss and damage, because the first tranche of funds from loss and damage are likely to go to countries like Pakistan and small island nations, because their evidence there is much, I would say, stronger. So Nepal has to, I think, work hard and then negotiate hard so that they can get loss and damage. And of course, third, you should not wait for what we call the loss to happen and damage to occur. You should build resilience. We have to build resilience across the systems. Our human system has to be resilient. Our natural system has to be resilient. Our infrastructure system have to be resilient. Our cities have to be resilient. So the resilience across the systems will prevent loss to happen and damage to occur. And then you don't have to ask for the compensation. So for Nepal has to also do this, what we call resilience building, by having multi-sector, multi-stakeholder, multi-scale approach. And of course, the last one is that you have to be very proactive. You don't have to wait that people will decide over Nepal. We have to be proactive diplomatically. We have to be proactive in negotiation. We have to be proactive in creating evidence and very strong, what we call the constituency, that your Nepal's agenda is also supported by others. So this is the first question. And regarding, of course, the last question, what the think tank like NDRI can do, of course, a very short one, they can do 4 or 5 things, I would say. First of all, they have to do research. Research-based research, without research, you don't create new knowledge. And climate change needs new knowledge because we are living in new normal and uncertain situation. And similarly, I would say the other, which I said, of course, R&D, Nepal has done very well with LAPA and EVA, the mountain EVA, ecosystem adaptation, but it hasn't done very well in nature-based solutions. Nature-based solution is much more than EVA. They can do that. They have to do policy advocacy, and since they have a lot of data, I think evidence-based policy advocacy can be done. And of course, capacity building, because Nepal needs capacity very badly. I have been doing capacity building of the NDA with basically Ministry of Finance for the last 1 year, and I know how much is needed. And then knowledge sharing, because of NDR as a knowledge-based organization. And of course, climate finance mobilization and developing, strengthening, transformative governance. As scientists have said, climate change issues are not really, not more than science, it's a governance issue. So we have to do transformative governance and transformative change, and I will stop here.
Thank you so much. I think it was very enlightening. We have about 25 minutes in the session left. I would like to give 10 minutes to Professor Ram Manohar Shrestha for his remarks. So let's take 4 questions from the floor and from the virtual. And when I say questions, the question has to end with a question mark. So please don't make comments so much. And briefly introduce your name, your organization, and a question in 2-3 lines, ending with a question mark. Yeah, so volunteers, 4 questions. Yeah, 1, 2. Yeah, please, Ranji. Yeah, 1 in the front. 1 in the front. 2 there. No, first here. First, he raised the hand first here, on the front. Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to make it thing. And we need to finish this in 15 minutes, 12 minutes, in fact, because I need to give 10 minutes to Professor Ram. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's me, Man Sirpali. I'm representing here as, from the British Council. So our plans, policies, and commitment, then also government's policies. Looking at all the ecosystems, my question raises here, who should actually lead? Because we are raising some concerns that is low carbon emission country, and also we are advocating also negotiating with the countries for as loss and damage. Dr. Karki, my question is how youth can be engaged, and what are the policies and platforms that government can actually offer to the young people at grassroots level? Like we have local operation, local government operation act, or so many other
Thank you,
policies.
Manji. I think your question is clear. I moved to the, it's clear, right, sir? Yeah. Now to Dilli ji on the corner there. Yeah. Ranji, you have to move fast.
Thank you, Diva sir. My name is Dilli Paudel, Diva sir mentioned, and I'm from South Asia Institute of Advanced Studies, SIAS. I'm a researcher there. I was also alumni of NDRI. I'm proud to say that. My questions actually, Madhav sir and also Arun sir both. Well, although we have receiving little fund, climate-related fund from international, if we have more fund, what do you think the potential area to be for the investment? I'm saying in the context of we have some some idea. For instance, nature-based solution, resilient construction, resilient agriculture. Well, this might be solution, but please answer your questions in the context of not having enough youth in the Himalaya, in the context of rapid migrations, in the context of decreasing agricultural practices. Yeah. Where should be the potential area for?
Thank you, Diliji. Now, 2 more questions, but I would strongly request 1 question to Dr. Parikh, Professor Parikh, and 1 question to Dr. Lanyang. That would be preferred. Anyone, please? Something about the energy strategy for India and how Nepal could learn, or from rural-urban integration and balancing development and environmental. Yes, please, Dr. Dheeraj.
My quick question to Dr. Parikh is, because we were talking about the air pollution or other pollutions in Kathmandu Valley or major mega cities, and I'd like to distinguish these issues with climate resilient future, particularly because they are also related with topography and some of the local climate impacts. And my question is, since the air pollution is also transboundary issues and from one city to another, so is there any way that the policy or some actions in India can be initiated so that the region could have also some better impact? So this is just
Thank you very much,
I'm
Dr. Dheeraj.
Dheeraj Pradhan from Tribhuvan University.
Now, may I request a question to, if possible, to Dr. Zhang Lanning. She talked a lot about China facing environmental degradation because of the rapid growth, and now they are having a more balanced development. So anybody to, a similar question, or if not, the question, I don't want to restrict the question, but one more question for now. Yeah, otherwise no problem. 3 questions is a very good number of questions. I will let Dr. Lanning also add to this, but maybe I'll start with Professor Parikh. Dheeraj asked about air pollution and if there are any transboundary actions we can take.
That sort of work we have done. Also, urban infrastructure. Many times, hazards need not turn into disaster if you have done a resilience plan. And this especially requires water body management and infrastructure management, as well as timely interventions when hazards do occur, especially early warnings and so on. So that's one aspect. But going away from cities, we should also, especially when Nepal has a hydro potential and much is expected to be harnessed, and that is going to require a lot of studies on what can happen with the precipitation cycle due to climate change, and how Nepal's hydropower would flow, in which directions, and it could change. Things can happen in an unexpected manner also. So we need to strengthen infrastructures. By that I mean both social health infrastructure as well as the infrastructure for buildings and roads and electricity, which should not fail during disaster, because that's the first thing you need when those things strike, and strengthen the digital infrastructure as well, because you need to communicate very fast in real terms to integrate
Professor Parikh, I think thank you so much.
Challenge.
I think you were very clear, loud and clear. So I will now go to Dr. Karki. I think the first question: who should lead?
Of course, the government should lead. First of all, I like your question. Thank you very much. Of course, the government should lead, because government has been given the responsibility by the people, and by government I mean legislation, which is the parliament, and then the executives, which is the government, and of course then we have the court system. So all 3 branches of the government have to take the lead. And what is the role for youth? I will just give you an example. I think a very terrible cyclone happened in Bangladesh in '71, I think, and I think more than Dr. Arun would know, more than 100,000 people died, and in fact it could be much more. And similar type of cyclone again happened, I think, recently in Bangladesh. Just few people died. So what happens is Bangladesh has put in place youth cadre, which I think with the first wording of an imminent, level 5 or level 4 cyclone, 1,000 youth with blue flag, they spring up and they are prepared. They prepare the community to really withstand and get protected from the cyclone disaster. So I think the youth have great role, and especially in adaptation, it's also risk reduction. In Nepal, Constitution has given responsibility to all level of government, but adaptation essentially and inevitably is a local phenomena. It has to be done by the local government. But right now, local government has no capacity. That's where the role of youth comes, because we have more than, I think, 45% of our population as youth, and they should be helping, of course, as a student, as a volunteer. They should have set up eco clubs, they should set up volunteer clubs, and whenever disaster strikes, they should be helping the government. And of course, they will need help. Of course, they need help in education, they need in capacity building. So that's my first response. And second is, of course, which sector we should give priority? That's again a very good question. Nice thing to start would be NDC document. NDC document has identified 4 sectors which are very important to reduce emission and also to adaptation. First is FOLO, agriculture, forest, and other land use, and that is both a sink and source of carbon. So we have to increase sink so that the carbon emission from other sectors like transportation, which is the second sector, IPPU, industrial processing and production like brick kilns and others, which produce, which are, I would say, agriculture, especially livestock, is difficult to abate sector. Similarly, in our case, I would say industrial processing and production is also difficult to abate sector. We have energy sector, which is happily going to renewables in a very satisfactory way, and we have to actually accelerate there also. And then we have transportation. And I think we have to realize that the biggest problem, biggest source of pollution in Kathmandu Valley is, of course, the construction activities, the bad roads, but I think transportation and very badly managed traffic, I think they create a lot of very, I would say, dangerous fumes in the atmosphere, and we have this pollution. So these 4 sectors are the priority.
Thank you. Arunji, maybe 1 minute for you, if you don't mind. I know you are good in.
I should get bonus because I finished in time last time. Okay. I'll touch on all 3, hopefully in 1 minute, very quickly. Who should lead? Yes, agree, government should lead, but when you say lead, there should be followers, right? Just one leader is not enough. That means, government should actually work with all the other, sectors, academia, research organizations, and other organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and use their competence in there, right? So that's what I would say on the first question. Youth, definitely very valuable, but I think what I would suggest is youth should also be knowledge-based, content-based, rather than just format-based. Oftentimes I see it is more format outreach, but the content is a little bit light. So improvement in that area would really strengthen the youth action. Diliji's question about priorities, if we had a lot of money, where should we work? I would highlight 3 areas, and not just one or other, but in parallel is evidence, getting evidence not just about the challenges, what is likely to be happening in the future, but also what are the opportunities, what are the solutions, right? Oftentimes we have some ideas and we would like to promote it without testing it, validating it, knowing the feasibility, knowing its scalability. So I think we really need to understand those things. And then with that, I think scaling is very important. So solutions that actually helps where the root cause is. And finally, Divasji, I would also like to touch on the air pollution issue. Dhirajji, I cannot see. Very important question. It's we are living in shared watershed, but we are also living in shared air share. I think that is very much. Pollution is also transboundary, so that's something which we also need to cooperate in solution. And just wanted to highlight that in 2022 we had a big conference here with World Bank, where we came up with what we call the Kathmandu Roadmap, which is mostly about. Sorry. Okay. somebody doesn't want to hear me, but I will close that. So that's something which is about, trying to regionally harmonize the understanding, the standards, and also come up with solutions that actually works for this region, and come up with government's initiative to work together in this issue. And we are going to take it forward again. Thank you very much, Divas.
Yeah, thank you, Arunji. Dr. Lanyang, I have to give you at least 90 seconds, 1.5 minutes to, say your final words. Please make it in 90 seconds, please.
90 seconds. I think the experience for the youth, the government set up the policy should create a space for the college students to have experience in the rural areas, but also allocation resources for them to involve, to create more business mode, social enterprise development into rural areas, linking with the community institutions. So this is a holistic system setting for really attract the youth back to support the rural development. And we had 20 years of experience working on this. So, so I think that's the lessons that is holistic environment supporting, and also institutions to train the youth to be involved and utilize youth skills, especially they are quite good at digitals and social media to help for the ecotourism or cultural tourism at community level. Yeah. So there's many ways. I think Nepal and China share a lot of common similarities, rich culture, beautiful landscape, rich natural resources. All this in China, we're talking about how to translate these resources, ecological resources, to be a kind of ecological business for the benefit of communities.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Lanning. Thank you for keeping it, making it in a timely manner. We have around 7 minutes until 25, but I want to do justice to Professor Ram, so I'm going to borrow 3 minutes from the next vote of thanks. So Professor Ram, if you don't mind, can you give your remarks, special remarks in 10 minutes, please? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Divasji. First of all, I would like to congratulate NDRI for its completion of 20 years of very valuable service to the nation as a think tank, and also like to thank for giving me this opportunity. I think my task has been made very easy after having listened to very comprehensive presentation by the keynote speaker, as well as a very thoughtful, enlightening statements from the panelists, distinguished panelists. So I probably will have only few things to say. Some of the things that I was preparing myself to share have been also already shared. Especially, I was thinking I will talk about the finance for adaptation. I think it was very well dealt with or presented by Dr. Karki. So thank you for doing that. Now, also a lot of things we have heard from different speakers about the role of capacity building. I think when we talk about the capacity building, we have to bear in mind that the research on mitigation and research on adaptation, they are of different nature. Of course, climate resilience can encompass both these activities, mitigation as well as adaptation. But keeping in mind that our country has been ranked 9th most affected country from the weather, extreme weather related events, according to the Climate Transparency Report of 2020. And also, according to the Asian Development Bank, Nepal will probably will be in a condition to lose about 2.2% of the GDP by 2050. These are not very casual things to ignore. I think we already are facing dire consequences of climate change in different parts of our country, and the loss to the GDP, loss to the economy, loss to the social well-being, they are also occurring in different ways. So I think we have to have many different approaches in place to deal with this crisis. Dr. Karki also mentioned a number of crises that we are facing, different kinds of crises due to climate change. So there is no single type of approach that will be enough to deal with, say, a problem of this magnitude. But one of the things I would like to emphasize in this brief presentation is building of capacity. Basically, I would like to emphasize that when we talk about capacity building, probably a lot of options for mitigation are internationally standard. They are well known. You can easily adopt and apply in our context. Except some, there may be nation specific, but most of the mitigation options are pretty much standard, and they can be easily borrowed, or the know-how can be easily used in different contexts. But when we come to the adaptation, the climate change adaptation issue, which is more important, we all probably agree to this in our context. We emit so less, so that way we are probably contributing so little to the global warming. But in terms of the consequences, the impacts, as I just shared, already we are ranked 9th most affected country from the extreme weather-related events. So adaptation is where probably our country will have to immediately focus on dealing with the challenge, dealing with the crisis. Now, when we said about this, there are different dimensions of the adaptation challenges. When we talk about, it has to be sectoral. The transportation sector, for example, will have its own various kinds of adaptation issues. Say the road in the Tarai and the road in the mid-hill, road in the high mountains, they all have their unique adaptation challenges. So one kind of adaptation approach in the transport sector clearly will not be adequate, will not work. So we have to build our national capacity to really deal with this kind of adaptation approaches that can address the challenges across the different topographical regions of the country. And similar thing we can say about agriculture. The adaptation challenge in Tarai Belt, adaptation challenge in the mid-hill and the mountain, they are in the agriculture. They are different in kind, and we have to build our capacity to address these varieties of adaptation challenges that are to be faced, and adaptation options that we have to identify and implement to address this problem. And of course, when we talk about the energy, we are prioritizing, we are telling that hydropower is one of our major driver of the economy. And climate, we all know that hydropower sector is probably one of the most vulnerable sectors that can be affected by climate change over years and decades. And again, hydropower itself has different kinds of hydropower, run-of-river hydropower, storage hydropower. You may have to have different kinds of adaptation options for each of these different kinds of hydropower. So on the one hand, we have the topographical variation to keep in mind when we talk about the adaptation approach. On the other hand, we have to also have the sectoral kind of adaptation approach to deal with different sectors that are affected by climate change. So one particular center for identifying, for analyzing the adaptation issue and building the necessary, say, adaptation approach will not be sufficient to deal with these varieties of adaptation approaches that are demanded by different sectors across the different topographical regions. So my thought is we have to have dedicated research centers, research and development centers at the sectoral level, and also, if possible, maybe that are also dedicated by sector and by region. If not by region, at least one dedicated sector, dedicated research and development center for each of the sector, major sector. So that means one dedicated research center for agriculture, one dedicated research center for transport, similarly for water resources, hydropower, irrigation, etc., and maybe for health, etc. So this is probably the thing. We may think that this is an academic type of approach. We are talking about having a lot of research centers, but I think without research and development on the adaptation approaches that are specific to our context, we will not be able to face the challenges, the problem of the climate change. So that is probably what I would like to emphasize on the capacity building. And the other point probably is about the adaptation approaches of different kinds. A lot of time we are focused on adaptation approach to a specific technology, a specific particular kind of, taking the example of, say, hydropower. A lot of time we know that hydropower probably will be suffering from the climate change crisis. There are examples from the case of Brazil. In the late 90s, Brazil suffered unprecedented drought. And at that time, the country was probably about 85 or 90% of its electricity was generated from hydropower. And that particular year, there was unprecedented drought, and hydropower generation was reduced to almost 20% or so, from 90%. So they had to have developed an approach that is, I say, macro adaptation approach. It's not particular to hydropower now, because hydropower is still suffering from climate change. Then they moved away from one particular dominant energy resource to multiple energy resources. They diversified to the other kinds of, say, power generation options. I think that probably we also have to, because ours is also similar. We are talking a lot about hydro, but in the impending climate change crisis, we will not be able to go ahead with relying on one particular type of energy generation source. So I think another, if you have 1 minute or
Yes.
so,
Okay, 1 minute.
1 minute or so, when we talk about the finance, adaptation finance, yeah, I don't want to repeat the very well articulated presentation from Dr. Karki, but ignoring the fact that there is a huge adaptation funding gap at present, so probably it is so difficult to access the adaptation finance for a country like Nepal, which has no capacity to prepare a good proposal, doesn't even have portfolio of projects and so on. But internally, at least we can educate our bankers, the financiers, especially they are heavily involved in providing loans for hydropower development. And if they are not building their capacity to assess the risk associated with the hydropower projects they are funding, I think they are putting themselves into huge risk in future. So educating and building capacity of the financing sector, the banking sector in Nepal will be of very big importance if we have to continue adapting even in sectors like hydropower. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, sir. I think we a little bit extended by time by 2-3 minutes, but of course we'll have a formal thank you remarks by our General Secretary very soon. But I should not stop without thanking our 4 eminent panelists for for their excellent presentation, and of course to Professor Ram Manohar Shrestha. I'm also very encouraged by the messages we received, for example, focusing on R&D, capacity building, evidence generation, which NDRI is focusing on, and also and the balance between development and ecology, eco-civilization, and also Professor Ram's recommendation to have dedicated sectoral research and R&D centers, I think. Just I would like, before I close, NDRI receives, we are, as our president mentioned, we are a non-profit organization. We don't have problem with finance to do our research, but most of our funding is coming from international sources. We have very or limited finance from national funding agencies. So I would also encourage the government and other partners to have national funds available for research institutes like Nepal. Then we can also focus on the national contextual agenda. Sometimes we apply for global funds, but the agenda is set by the global agencies naturally. So I just wanted to add that. And by thanking Dr. Lanieng, Dr. Shrestha, Professor Parikh, and Dr. Karki, and Professor Ram, I would like to close the panel session right now. Over to you, Asmaji.
Thank you very much, Dr. Basnet, Professor Ram, and our wonderful panelists for such an informative segment. It indeed was an eye-opener. As we near the end of our event, I would like to express our deepest gratitude for your presence and participation. Thank you everyone for making this event a memorable experience. We hope you had a great time. For the vote of thanks, I would like to hand over the floor to Dr. Manjeshwari Singh. Dr. Singh is the Generalist Secretary at NDRI. I would like to request Dr. Singh to conclude today's program. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Asmaji. So I have only 3 minutes, I think. So namaste and good afternoon, everyone. Distinguished chairpersons, guests, speakers, all the participants, including those who have joined virtually, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of NDRI, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude for your gracious presence at this special program on completion of 2 decades of NDRI's journey. I thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this event. To our esteemed chief guest, the Honorable Minister Nawal Kishore Shah Sudhi, thank him for gracing us with his presence and for sharing insight. Similarly, I would like to thank our special guest, Ms. Ayeshani Labe, the resident's representative of UNDP, for her presence and encouraging remarks. To our keynote speakers, Dr. Pema Gyamcho, your expertise and insights have enlightened us and inspired us. We are thankful for your valuable contribution and knowledge you have imparted. To our expert panelists, Dr. Zhang Langying, Dr. Arun Bhakta Shrestha, Dr. Jyoti Parikh, Dr. Madhav Karki, thank you for joining us virtually and in person for a lively discussions on the important agendas. We were privileged to have such a group of panelists with profound knowledge and reputations. Your contributions have been invaluable, and we appreciate the time and efforts you have taken to be with us. Special thanks to Professor Dr. Ram Manohar Shrestha for your encouraging remarks, and Dr. Dibas Basnet for facilitating panel discussion session on way forward for a climate-resilient future effectively. I would also like to thank NDRI President Dr. Krishna Pahari, Executive Director Dr. Shankar Shrestha, and all members of NDRI family for organizing this event successfully. We take this opportunity to thank you all, the partners and stakeholders, for their support to our work for collection good of our society. Special thanks goes to NDRI organizing team for the meticulous planning and execution of today's celebration. Your tireless efforts have ensured a seamless and memorable experience for everyone present. Last but not least, I extend my deepest gratitude to each and every one of you, our cherished guests, for your unwavering support, encouragement, and belief in NDRI's vision. Together, we have achieved remarkable milestones, and I'm confident that with your continued support, we will strive towards even greater heights in the years to come. Once again, thank you for being part of NDRI's journey and for making this 21st anniversary celebration an unforgettable experience. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
I have one last announcement to make. May I request our dear participants to collect our lunch coupons from one of our NDRI executives at the door. The lunch will be served at the dining area in the hotel's main building. Thank you. Happy New Year.